It's percolating.
All right. So the interesting thing about uh, yeah, the interesting thing about that question, like the question basically you're asking is, why is it sometimes I read someone's hands and they don't seem to be exhibiting the characteristics that I would associate with the features that I would see on the hand? Well, you said, well, this woman had 5 whorls and she didn't seem particularly whirly or independent, and so on and so forth. Well, the first answer to that question is you need to look at everything else in the hand as well. So, like whorls on an earth hand will behave differently than whorls on a fire hand. And one of the biases in my presentation and any European's presentation is that we will be into understanding the significance of all the hand features that we talk about in the context of a fire handshake and a fire culture. If I went to India or Thailand or Papua New Guinea, I'd be a terrible hand reader because I wouldn't understand the culture and I wouldn't understand the people. I couldn't even necessarily translate what I see in the hands in terms of jobs because I just don't know what kind of jobs they do in Papua New Guinea. There's all sorts of other cultural factors which are important. So the first thing to note is that any interpretation of a hand is culturally relative. But that's not the only problem. So assuming that we have some understanding of the culture that we're in, and that's why hand reading requires the study of psychology and sociology and economics and history and religion, because you need to understand the cultural context in which we all live. And none of us lives except within a cultural context. So that's the kind of the key thing we have to understand. What is the cultural context in which that person resides? And what happens to us as children is we're born and we're born into an economic situation, a political situation, a sociological situation. We're born working class or upper class. We're born with money, no money, live in great housing or poor housing, in a great part of town. We may be black or coloured or disadvantaged politically in some kind of way, depending on which culture we're in. And there's all those kind of economic pressures, and that then leads to the kind of jobs that your parents do, and therefore the kind of money you've got, therefore the kind of housing you've got, therefore the kind of levels of mold and you're going to be exposed to in your house, which means that's going to affect your levels of health and illness, and there are lots of sort of health and economic opportunity outcomes for those kind of conditions. So a person is very much a product of their environment and product of influences around them. And so they will create a sense of their own identity based upon those things. So most people's sense of self-identity is based upon their family and the family values, the economics of the situation they grew up in, and the expectations of the social class that they're in. Or if they've had some experience like being brought up in a Catholic church, they will be very constrained in terms of their view of who they are and what their role is. And if they're a woman, they'll be very constrained by the notions of the prevailing society about who they are and what their role is. I mean, it's absolutely axiomatic that basically, whorls are much more common in the hands of men than they are in the hands of women anyway, but it's absolutely much more difficult for women with lots of whorls to enact the whorls because of the political constraints of patriarchy and misogyny that's inherent within the sort of capitalist economic system in which we live. So women will naturally diminish themselves because of that political power. And so one of the things they must diminish, and what they must learn to do, particularly in Catholicism, is they must need to learn to be an obedient wife. And that's the mark of you being a good person. And that's the mark of you being a successful person. Now, what the heck are you supposed to do with that if you've got whorls? That's going to be incredibly self-suppressing. So it's quite possible for people to live in an ideological framework that actually completely denies what it is to be them. So what you've got then is you've got, and this is essentially what we're doing as hand readers. We're basically saying, you are not what other people are telling you to be. You're not restricted by those things. You're not defined by those things, although you have defined yourself by those things. And that's a quite normal thing to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that's not to say you're not affected by those things, because your personality will be part of that. For example, educational opportunities. If you're white, middle class and well off, you're more likely to go to university, be better educated. And it's not that you can't go to university if you're Hispanic and from a poor neighborhood, but it's less likely that you will. And your parents might not encourage you to do that anyway. And they might say, no, go and get a job, because we've got 15 children and we need all, and as soon as you're able to go to work, you go and earn some money and help the family. So there's all sorts of constraints about what person might be able to become because no matter what their innate skills are, by virtue of those social and economic situations. So, but what we as hand readers are particularly, what the people we particularly important for are those people who go, wait a minute, that doesn't feel like me. I don't fit in this situation. I'm not kind of, it doesn't kind of work. And then people aren't going, well, who am I? And until they ask that question, they're not interested, they're not able to have a hand reading, not interested in having a hand reading, and hand reading is completely irrelevant to them. Because what hand reading does is basically says, let's look at who you are, irrespective of all those social conditions. You know, this is like, so most people's sense of self-definition is from an external source going in. So they're kind of, there's an imposition of a worldview or a politics or a philosophy or a religion that kind of actually colors their sense of who they are, and they only define themselves, can only operate within those paradigms. Whereas what hand reading it does says is like, well, what do you hear? What can you bring out? You know, so it's like, what are you on the inside and what can you bring out? But what people have to do to get to hand reading is they have to flip that. They have to do what they're doing is they're being a mirror to what's outside of them. They have to sort of break the mirror. And it's the breaking the mirror that actually enables them to get through to themselves. Now, there's lots of ways that you can do that. Breath work will do that. Taking LSD will do that. Anything that kind of sort of, you know, shatters the frameworks by which you've been perceiving the world will create a liberation from those conditions that are restricting how you see yourself, and therefore restrictions on how you can be in the world. And so most people come for hand reading at a time of crisis, when that self-image has been shattered. They've been abused. They've had a business has gone bankrupt. Their marriage has just broken up. They live alone and they live with lots of cats, you know, that sort of thing. They kind of like, they come to a point where they kind of decide it's time to redefine myself because I don't feel like I'm being who I really am. And well, how do I do that? Because I don't even know who I really am. So they want to answer that question. And so that's when hand reading becomes really useful. But it's basically saying you are affected by all these situations around you and you're not completely independent of them. But if you can understand what your forces are, you can navigate your way through that stuff with greater clarity and in accordance with a kind of inner vision of who you are. But to do that, you have to kind of develop that inner vision of who you are first. And that's what people mostly struggle with. So it's a real problem when you're looking at a hand. What you can't tell from a hand is how self-aware somebody is. So you just can't tell. You know, you could see a doubled major waterline and you can't tell whether they're a brilliant artist or actor or whether they're a sort of raving schizoid psychopath. You actually can't tell from the hand itself, you know, because what you're looking at is an internal process and you're not necessarily clear about how it's externally manifesting.
Yeah.
So we can't. So when it's a really big problem, you know, when reading hands, it's like, is it possible to actually see how aware somebody is? And the answer is no, it's not. There are a number of factors in the hand that tell you, that kind of give you an indication that the person isn't very self-aware. I mean, I can just enumerate some of those straight away. Radial loop on the index finger is a big one, or any upper minor water lines is a huge one. But having a short airline will make someone not very self-aware either, because they don't think very deeply into themselves. Someone with a long ring finger might not be very self-aware because all they're concerned about is image. They're concerned about how they appear. They don't have a sort of internalized psychological self-awareness. There's a number of features in the hand that can show people can have illusions about themselves or erroneous perceptions about themselves, or just haven't thought enough about themselves. So that's one factor. Yeah. And one more thing. And the second factor is that you can look at someone's hand and you can see some people's hands show that they are very strongly affected by people, situations, and circumstances. So you've got someone with a hyper bendy thumb who's just people pleasing and just being what someone else wants them to be, or a woman with a short low Z-air finger who's had such terrible childhood experiences that she's got low self-worth, so she's constrained by that. Or someone who's got excess earth, like a very tired air and earth line, have been very constrained by their upbringing and the conditions of their childhood. So so you can see whether someone's been inhibited by their childhood experience, which means they're probably not liberated from those conditionings. So, so what we're talking about here is in hand reading is how to liberate people from the social conditioning that defines them in a very limited way, such that their life is not an expression of who they are. Does that make sense?
It does. One thing that occurred to me when you were speaking was what a difference there is between someone coming to you for a hand reading, asking you to do it, and someone saying, okay, when I say, can I print your hands? Because I'd like to compare, the you that I've known for 20 years to what I see in your hands.
Yes,
She's not ready to ask me for a hand reading.
no, and therefore she's not ready to know, and she doesn't want to know. Yeah, no, that's a really important moral point, actually, and I'll talk about that now as well. If you ask someone for a hand reading and they say yes, it's great. You're under no obligation to tell them anything about the hand, because they don't want to know. Because if they wanted to know, they would have asked you. All right. So they might say, "Oh, that's really interesting. What can you tell?" And if they do that, then you know, oh look, you've got a word on your index finger. Gosh, I bet you're the kind of person that doesn't like being told what to do, aren't you? You just give something fairly light, and say, "Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, I am like that. Oh, that's amazing. Oh, it's really interesting, this hand reading." And that's the end of it. They don't want to know. They won't kind of go any further than that. So you kind of give them a tidbit, a little bit of something, just so they feel like. But they didn't ask for a hand reading. They didn't say, "Excuse me, I'd like to have a deep dive into my depths of my consciousness right now. Can we just sit down for a moment?" And that's why it's really important to avoid people at parties where you come up to you and say, "Oh, I hear your hand read. Oh, go on in, have a look at mine." I mean, the answer is that has always got to be no. But it's a really important point. It's a really important moral point from the point of view of hand reading. There's a big difference when someone comes to you for a hand reading. They've asked you, they've invited you in. So what that means is you also have to say to them, you do know it's not fortune telling. You do know it's quite deep. It's a bit like psychotherapy. Like they need to kind of be appraised of what they're about to get into, so they don't think it's going to be all fortune telling and tall dark strangers and babies and all that stuff. So, but that's completely different than if you ask someone else. They don't know what you do, and they don't know how far you can go. So there's a boundary breaching issue there, and you have to handle that very delicately, and it's important not to intrude into people's consciousnesses.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna talk about it differently. Like when I could getting prints from people for my own use, that they're nice enough to offer. That's one thing, but that's not the time to tell them anything about it unless they ask me. That's how I'm going to do it.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
You got it. Absolutely.